Good morning, good evening to everyone. Today I am speaking with a gentleman that I hope you have some inclination as to who he is, and if you don't, then shame on you. Today I'm speaking with Dylan Grice. Many of you might have come across Dylan's work when he was at SocGen, where he became somewhat famous or infamous. But welcome to Dylan, and perhaps instead of that fairly lousy introduction, you can give us some inclination as to who you are and how it is that you've come to building Calderwood Capital, because I think that's clearly where your focus is now, and it's your diverse experience that you've had in that I'm aware of that presumably has led you to what you're doing now.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on. It's fascinating to be on your show, for sure. Who am I? In simple terms, primarily an investor. Calderwood Capital was really being started from quite recently. We got it up and running last year. It's really a kind of combination, really, of a lot of the things that I've been doing in the past. You mentioned SocGen. I worked there for several years with Albert Edwards. We had a lot of fun. It was a great time, and as you say, I kind of had a certain amount of success as a pundit. And as a market commentator, and that was great. I enjoyed it. But before SocGen, I'd actually been a prop trader for several years. I was actually kind of more used to being involved in the market, directly involved in the market, rather than just talking about markets. So I found the kind of experience of being a market commentator enormous fun though it was. It didn't really satisfy me enough. It wasn't enough for me. So I left. I kind of went in the other direction, and I moved to Switzerland. I was fortunate enough to be offered a job with a family office over in Switzerland, one of the biggest family offices in Europe. They kind of whether it was a good decision or not, I think it worked out okay, but they wanted me to kind of build an equity business for them, which I did. After that kind of went reasonably well, they kind of asked me if I would do the same thing for the broader liquids business. So I kind of built the equity business, and then I built the broader liquids business, liquid investing business, which was much more of a kind of allocation role. So in the family office, I was kind of every single day, every minute of every day, I was thinking about investing. I was thinking about the markets. I built a team. I hired the guys. I hired the analysts. I laid down the intellectual architecture. How do you make decisions? How do you make investment decisions in a non-arbitrary, repeatable way, which hopefully will stop you from doing stupid things. And I said, how do you build a business? How do you actually build a business? When I joined, my kind of commitment to the family office was that, listen, I'm going to build you something that doesn't need me to run. Okay, so if I leave, it's not all just going to fall apart, right? So there will be some continuity, and the way you get that continuity is that you actually have some kind of common philosophy, some kind of embedded ideas about what constitutes correct thinking and what doesn't, right? And that's what I did there. So in the family office, it was all investing. It was just pure investing, and it wasn't really very much writing. One of the things that I did miss about SocGen, one of the things that I did miss about the world of punditry was that discipline of writing your thoughts down, writing about what you think, because this is, for me, and I think it's probably true for most people who write, this is ultimately how you kind of self-educate. and I'd missed that. And so Calderwood was really a combination of the thinking and the writing. We've started to kind of publish research again on a subscription basis. So we don't give it out for free. We sell it to clients. But it's also an investment business. We are in the process of setting up a hedge fund right now, which will be a fund of funds very much based on the kind of family office mentality and philosophy. We're aiming to launch that in September. So Calderwood is really, I'm doing this with a few partners, by the way, it's not all just about me. But Calderwood really is is that combination of the kind of, the kind of engaging with the markets through as I did with SocGen, through writing and exploring ideas. But I'm also engaging with the markets in a much more real sense because I'm investing in them, because we're going to be investing in them through the fund.
Fantastic. I think that's a great intro into your, I guess, evolution. And it's interesting that you say that. I think one of the things that has been, I'm curious as to whether you agree with this statement. What I've found is that when you sit down to write something, especially if you know that on the other side of that are some ridiculously smart, critical thinkers, when you're forming that opinion, it's always an opinion based on analysis and all the various metrics that you're looking at. You go through a process of having the devils on your shoulder going, hey, you could be wrong. And it's what you're doing is you're getting up on a stage and you're presenting your thesis or your idea or whatever it might be, which it's like, and I had this with my son the other day. So he's has to do a speech at school, and he's put this together. He's spent some time on it. I've helped him formulate it, and then he's standing up to practice it with Dad, and he's nervous, And I'm like, what the hell's wrong with you? It's like, it's your dad. Like, we've been through this. So, but he's still a little bit nervous, and when he gets up, but he knows that when he does get up in front of a class for 30 people, it's even more like there's 30 people who are all now critical. And then there's the teacher who's going to be really sitting there looking for certain points and so on and so forth. And so to a certain extent, it's that at scale through a digital divide. And when you know that you have, as I'm sure you have clients, and I have clients who are, anybody would notice their names if they came across them. And these are people that are sitting there on the other side of the material that you're putting forward. And they are, in some instances, your own heroes. It makes you really think critically about what it is that you're doing. And it makes, I think you go through a process that is a bit more, it helps you be more critical, I think, than I would otherwise. Like when I was just managing my own capital, not writing anything, I could make any decision I damn well pleased, and I knew it. Sure, I didn't want to lose money, and you've got that skin in the game thing. But there's another element to that. Firstly, when you manage other people's capital, then it becomes much more real, because it's one thing losing your own money, losing other people's money is definitely something altogether different. And then taking that to an even greater audience of presenting the ideas behind it, it adds an extra layer. And I think you can use that to sort of hammer out your own critical thinking more than you might otherwise.
So what's the question?
is that yeah, no, I rambled on too much there, but is that so? I mean, is that something that you would agree with, or do you find it's something that you don't really think too much about? You sit down, you write something. Who do you write for, I guess, is part of the question.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think too much about it. I don't think too much about audience criticism, and I don't think too much about what if I got this wrong? What if I'm completely wrong? I mean, when I write, it's really just a huge exercise in introspection. So one of the problems I have with writing, one of the difficulties I have with writing, and I have to say I'm not a good writer. I hate writing. I hate the process of writing. I find it enormously valuable, and I love it when I've done it. I find the benefits, instantly visible, and as I say, tangible. But I really don't like the process. I find it a very difficult process. Because quite often I find that the idea that I'm writing about, the hypothesis that I kind of had in mind, as I start to write about it and do the analysis, I realise that hypothesis is wrong, and therefore the entire kind of construct of the argument is frequently misplaced. It was wrong. And so I need to figure out how to get it right and what's wrong about it. And then so the whole process is often kind of very, very kind of iterative. In fact, it's nearly always an iterative one. It's very rare that I actually start out writing a piece with a hypothesis in mind, and the hypothesis actually makes it through the piece unscathed. So in other words, that's actually quite a painful thing, because you think, oh, this will take me an afternoon to write, or this will take me a day to write, and then 4 days later you're still writing the same bloody piece, and you're thinking, oh my God, I've got this bloody rabbit hole. And actually, and by this time you're getting impatient, and you want to get on with your life, and I don't want to do this.
Dylan, isn't that the process? That, I guess that's you've explained it better than I could. Isn't that the process of working through your own thinking? Because you think, okay, I have this idea, you start putting it down, and then automatically you're criticizing it, and you're going, hang on a second, there's this, oh, there's that, and you like 4 days later, what you come out with 4 days later is not just a different piece, but it's a different level of thinking yourself. Correct. The way that you view whatever it was that you started with is now different, because you've actually brought a lot of energy into it.
Well, and actually, you've grown, right? You've actually grown. You now understand something in a way that you didn't understand it before, and growth is usually painful, right? And so I find the process of writing quite painful, but I can absolutely tangibly feel my own growth. I can feel that I understand whatever it was I've been writing about in a way that I hadn't before. And so to go back to your kind of question, do you worry that other people might say that? No, I don't. I think by the time I've actually got something that I'm happy with, I think, no, I think I'm basically right on this. And if I'm not right on it, I know where the sensitivities are. I know which parts people might disagree with, because they might have different assumptions, and they might have very reasonable different assumptions. That's kind of fine. But I feel that after I've written about it, I feel that I've really understood it. And so when I was at the family office, I was doing. I wasn't just thinking. I was doing. I was building, and I was making mistakes. And I was making mistakes in the portfolio. I was making mistakes in hiring. I was making mistakes in managing the team. I was making all sorts of mistakes, setting the wrong examples with my own behavior, all sorts of different things that you can only really learn by doing. But the one thing that I missed was I wasn't introspecting to the same degree, the way that I can only really do with writing. And so that's so maybe that kind of answers your part of your question. I think there was another part of the question which was interesting, but the skin in the game, and it's okay doing your own thing, managing your own capital, taking risks with your own kind of money. But when you start managing other people's, then it kind of becomes different. And I think that's true. That's something that I think people maybe don't pay enough attention to with skin in the game, or maybe the idea of skin in the game does need to be broadened out, because I speaking from personal experience, I know that I have taken a risk. I'm not a reckless risk taker at all, right? Definitely not. I really, in fact, I don't like taking risk. I only like to invest when I really feel that this is. I suppose you could say you're comfortable with the risk. I don't take kind of flyers, right? I don't just take punts. I always do investing very kind of deliberatively. However, I definitely invested in things without doing the kind of work that I would have done had I been investing other people's capital, right? I've definitely taken shortcuts with my own kind of analysis with my own work. And to some degree, in fact, to a large degree, investing your own money is easier than investing other people's money, because we're kind of, you set up a kind of fund, you set up a vehicle, and you've got friends and family's money in there. Yep. And Jesus, you really don't want to be losing that, or you don't want to be playing games with that. That's a burden. That's actually, now that focuses your mind. That gets you thinking, do I actually understand what the hell is going on?
Yeah, I liken it to having children. When before I had children, I had me to take care of. Big deal. And you think about starting businesses, which is risk. You think about any of those sorts of things, and it's different. And for some people, they, I had this discussion with a friend some years back now, and he was interested in starting up his own business. He was in our field. He had worked, as you had, for large institutional companies where, if you do a good job and you hang it out, you're going to get paid well, and you can stay there until you're old and doddery, basically, and they cart you out. And he wanted to, take that leap, and that leap meant that there was obviously more risk, and then there was kids were going to be born, and he was like, oh, I need to do it, I either need to do it now and kind of make sure that it's set up before we go and have children, or wait until I've had children and he's like really stuck in this whole thing. And I realized it's actually a very, it can affect different people different ways. So for me, having children meant that I didn't want the risk of being an employee. I saw that as being risky. I felt a lack of control. Whereas if I was the entrepreneur running my own thing, I had more control, and I felt like I had more of that risk of the downside taken care of, because now I had these obligations, I had these liabilities, and they were my responsibility. But not everybody looks at it like that. So there's different, there's different things that drive you in a certain way. And you mentioned managing, family and friends' money. Same thing for me. Now, we both know that there are people out there where if they're managing others' money, they're far more reckless with it. We've seen it. I mean, there's movies that have been made about it and things of that nature. So it's I guess the answer is that there is no one size fits all to that equation. But it's I'm grateful for your insights into how you think about things. And I think, even just for individual investors,
the relationship's important. When you're sitting, when I started out as a prop trader for a bank, I'd kind of sit on the floor and I kind of asked, I used to say, where does this money come from? Right?
Landed in my account. That's wonderful. Whose is it?
Exactly. It was just there, and it was a kind of sign of the times. This was kind of 2003 to 2007, and it was a Dresdner, Kleinworts was the bank. So it was a decent bank. It was a good bank. Kleinworts, in particular, before Dresdner bought it, was one of the most kind of prestigious banks in the UK historically. Very, very kind of steeped in the kind of history of British finance. Dresdner took it over. It was still a big bank, but it wasn't Goldman Sachs. It wasn't Morgan Stanley. Second tier, frankly. But we had multi-billion euro book.
Yeah.
Right? There was like 5 or 6 of us, and we were all kind of punting around billions of euros, frankly, with no idea what we were doing, which is another sign of the times. But when you ask people, where does this money come from? I don't understand. Where's it? Oh, this is treasury. Yeah, but where does that come from? Where does the treasury come? There was not really a clear answer. No one really kind of knew it. So there was something very abstract about these kind of numbers on a screen.
Yeah.
When you got to the family office, it was different because we knew the family, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to let the family down. Obviously, if you let a family down, you get fired on a professional basis. Not good, but it was more.
It's a different thing. It's a different thing.
This is theirs, and so you felt a very different kind of relationship to it. And when you're managing friends and family's money, then it's there is a relationship which forms the basis of the business, really. And so you're kind of you have to be very, very careful with the relationship. You want to safeguard, protect the relationship, and you don't want to do anything that jeopardizes the trust and the faith that these people have shown in you. And you don't get that when you're in a bank. And I doubt very much that you get that when you're in BlackRock or a Fidelity, and you're in your clients. It's not their money either, right? Your clients are agents of other principles, or agents of agents of agents of principles. So you just lose track of who you're actually dealing with, and that's the problem, I think, with big finance. It's basically a principal agent problem.
It's Dylan. It's a problem that transcends finance. I think it's a problem in terms of even the structures of societies. You're sitting in Switzerland, and Switzerland has cantons, and each of those cantons operates relatively independently. They can make their own laws, and they can do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And exactly. And within that, there's the proximity to power for individuals is far closer, and the relationships are far more intricate than they would be in a different structure. If we think about, and I'm going to go off on a tangent here, my grandmother grew up, well, she spent much of her adulthood in the UK, and I lived over there for about 6 years. And I remember her talking to me about how the police worked. And you had a bobby on the streets, okay? And that was in your local villages. Everybody knew who the police were, and they would walk the streets and they would talk to people, and they knew who the good families were. They knew who everybody was. When anything happened, immediately they pretty much knew it was, they had already consolidated in their mind probabilities. And so their proximity to their clients essentially was very close, and the relationships that they had with them was very close. So you have a feedback mechanism where if you knew the policeman in town and you knew you were going to do something, or you were thinking about doing something that was illegal, or would, you had this, it wasn't just the fact that it was illegal to do it, you also knew that you were going to disappoint that person if they ever found out. And so that was the kind of structure. And if you think about what you have now, nobody knows, the policeman, the local policeman in town. Nobody. It's just a big corporation. So it's the same thing you think about, like mortgages. Like if you borrowed money from your auntie to buy a house, the chance of you defaulting is extraordinarily different to that which if you borrowed from Deutsche Bank, some large faceless corporation, you can quite easily just say they're a bunch of bastards, and they've probably got a bunch of dodgy prop traders there trading their book, and they're against me. And and look, we know it kind of happens. So the ability, that whole structure of society is actually quite different. Coming back to what we're talking about, that proximity to clients, I think you can use it to your advantage, can be really important. And one of the things that we do at Glenorchy is every single client that comes in, because we're not interested in about massive AUM, we we have a phone call, at least one. We want to talk to them. We want to find out who they are. We want to determine that we're on the same page, and we just basically want to get to know who they are. So, and I feel like we've gone very far down that end of massive asset aggregation and allocation, and the proximity of people, investors, to who's managing their capital, where it's sitting, is being so severely disconnected over the years that and then there's an ability for for asset managers to not it's just capital. It's like, where did it come from? Oh, it was an allocation from some faceless pension fund. It was an allocation from some faceless multi-family office, or whatever the case might be. There's no so when you sit down and you're allocating your net capital, you're not thinking about, as you do, as I do, like the family and friends that you start off with, which is how we normally start these things, right? Because then you're sitting there and you're going, shit, I know all these people, and I really don't want to fuck this up. So
I think the kind of principle here that ties it all together with your kind of example of the kind of local policeman and the example of the way the Swiss run their country, with very local politics and very local decision making. The principle is that the closer the decision is to the consequences of that decision, the better. And so I think that, I remember when I first came to Switzerland, there was a vote, because the Swiss, they vote all the time, right? And people don't fully understand. People talk about democracy, and people talk about the strength and power of democracy, and the Americans trying to bring democracy to the Middle East. It's a very dysfunctional democracy. Most countries have an incredibly dysfunctional democracy. The two-party system in America is almost kind of farcical. You're looking at Trump versus Biden. What kind of choice is that, right? Some kind of mean-spirited, uneducated, narcissistic bully against a guy who's got dementia. Yeah. Right? That's your choice. That's democracy. Right? So that's a farce. Before that, it was Trump versus Clinton, which is equally farcical. The UK is kind of the same. We just got this two-party system, right? So I prefer that to Russia or China. But you could really improve it enormously if you study the Swiss system. And for me, Switzerland is the only country that I'm aware of, at least, that actually has real democracy, right? So like not just the canton, but the municipality that I lived in, which is like a couple of thousand people, they wanted to build a new sports centre. And so the leaders of the community put it out to the community. They made the case for a new sports centre, right? A, we need it. B, this is how much it's going to cost. And C, this is who's going to oversee it, right? And they then voted on it, right? And they agreed, the municipality agreed that they would pay an extra few hundred francs a year to cover the costs for the next 3 years, to cover the costs of this new sports club, right? And then that would be that. And then the tax would, right? So it was a very, very precise vote, right? This is what we want. This is how much it's going to cost. This is going to be the tax burden, the additional tax burden that's implied. And this is how long that additional tax burden will be active for. Right? Now, do we want to do this or don't we want to do this, right? And this was only, which by the way meant that my municipality had a slightly higher tax rate than the neighbouring one.
Then you're having a different municipality, because that one has a sports ground and the other ones presumably do not. Or that one that's maybe 15, 20 years old.
This is purely local decision making.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you ask these people, in other words, people who are voting on this have access to better information. For example, do we need a local sports centre? There's one just down the road. Why can't we just use that? Okay, that's important, that information. Actually, there's no kids around. Who the hell needs a new sports centre, right? Again, this is, or actually, on the contrary, no, we really, really need it. Okay, so aggregate all of that into a collective opinion, and that will take advantage of good information, right? And therefore, the decision is being made with good information in a way that it wouldn't if it was being made in Brussels, right? And you had to write a grant application.
And look, we know this. We know the system, right? Because if the alternative worked, you and I would be speaking Russian.
Yeah, right.
And yet you see this consolidation of power that takes place in many countries, and it keeps consolidating. But Switzerland, I think, is a wonderful example. You could say there are some negatives to it, and sure there are. But
there are.
One of the things in terms of systems, and this is actually a phenomenon I came across some time back from a friend of mine over in Australia. We looked at various systems in nature and those which survived. And so in order to survive, you needed to essentially have, this is a rough metric, about 2/3 of a system that was very, very robust to external exogenous negative impulses or negative impacts. And the 1/3 needed to be growth, or needed to be innovation. And so if you think about innovative companies, you can be super, super innovative, and you can grow at an absolutely exponential rate, right? Okay, so WeWork. I know WeWork is a bit of a fuck up, but essentially WeWork grew ridiculously quickly because they were somewhat innovative. I mean, it was kind of fraudulent finance. The whole structure of it didn't really make sense in terms of how it was done. But they were certainly innovative, and they grew very, very quickly. But they had no fundamental robust structure, whereby if anything negative came along in that market, i.e. a lack of financing, i.e. COVID would have shut them down anyway, even if they had kind of died before that. But they didn't have that structure. So, but then you have a company or a structure which is very, very much robust, if you will, but it doesn't have enough innovation. It can get run over by innovation. So if you think about Kodak, it had all of the structure. It was by all standards visibly. You would have said that's something that's going to survive. Maybe it's not going to. It's not going to become maybe even larger. But yeah, it'll be around in the next 10, 20 years. But then you had this exogenous force which came along, and because they didn't have enough innovation and any ability to actually tackle and change, they died. And you have that sort of thing taking place time and again. And so when you think about Switzerland and the cantons, they've got this flexibility, right, which does impede, if they wanted to grow out and build a massive rail network all around the country. That's pretty difficult, because now you've got to get all these different municipalities on board, and it takes a lot more. That's where a centralized system, such as China has, they can go out and they can build whatever the hell they please. Because if someone someone doesn't like having a train track coming through their yard, too fucking bad. They just push it through. But over time, that decentralized approach. I mean, if you think about country structures, Switzerland's kind of like the Bitcoin of or the blockchain of democratic systems, because it has this decentralized approach which allows a lot of flexibility.
Yeah. It is slow. It's slower to move. I think that one of the cantons, because you don't get the same. It's something I think of a lot. It's very, very interesting. The kind of centralization versus decentralization. I think the decentralization works for all sorts of reasons, mainly because it allows bad ideas to fail, right? And that's the fundamental algorithm of life, is to repeat what works. And if you have kind of, a whole bunch of different ideas kind of playing out in kind of reality, and inevitably some of those ideas will work and some of them won't. The ones that don't die, and the ones that do succeed and continue and are replicated and are copied. And this is, you need to have a decentralized, you need to have a whole bunch of experiments, a whole bunch of simulations before you can actually optimize, before you can select the winner, if you like, or before the winner actually wins. I guess the kind of conundrum is what happens when the winner is actually centralization, right? And so what happens when if you've got, for example, historically in Europe, Switzerland was always kind of at risk because it would struggle to compete with highly organized and centralized neighbors, like France, right, or Spain, for example. And so at what point, right now we're seeing it with China. China might not be a kind of great place to live. It might not be particularly ultimately robust or stable given this kind of one-party system, but they can mobilize incredibly quickly and incredibly powerfully. And, maybe that is actually, that can be the dominant strategy at times, right? To kind of suppress the experimentation, to suppress the decentralization, to centralize, to harness all of your resources for one battle and for one victory. And so, you can do all sorts of things when you harness power centrally. And one of the things you can do is mobilize aggression, right? And so, what's the kind, and therefore the most aggressive, organized, centralized state can actually dominate all the others, right? So I think that there has to be a kind of balance between centralization and decentralization. And I think that this is one of the things that the cryptocurrency guys don't really, to my mind, I think that they maybe don't fully appreciate. I think that there is which is very, very commendable and very, very laudable, but they do have a fetish of decentralization. We live in Switzerland. We used to live in Zug, which was Crypto Valley, as it's called, because they actually they had a lot. I mean, the Ethereum Foundation was based there. ETH was conceived in Zug, I believe. My wife actually runs her own cryptocurrency company. She was one of the first ICOs in Switzerland. So we had kind of first-hand experience, or we had front row seats to the whole ICO bubble and bust. We're still very, very active in that space right now. And one of the things that really strikes me is this fetish of decentralization. And you're seeing the problems with radical decentralization with Ethereum right now. I think Ethereum, this might be a little bit kind of niche, but I'm assuming everyone knows what Ethereum is, and I'm assuming everyone knows what ETH is, right?
Well, so if they don't, they can certainly Google it, and there's enormous amount of information about it.
Like Bitcoin. Ether is the same as basically like Bitcoin, except you can program Ether
around it,
right?
Yeah.
It's actually programmable money, right? So you can make. And Bitcoin, I can send you a transaction. Okay, fine. I can send you Bitcoin. That's a transaction that gets validated. It's been peer-to-peer transfer of value. Fine. You can do exactly the same thing using Ether or any cryptocurrency. With Ether, though, I could send you some Ether, some money, conditional on a particular event, right? So we would then program this money only to transfer to you if, say, your house got burgled. Right, and then it would be right, and then
insurance contract,
and then it would be an insurance contract. Right, so we can program this money, and this is actually a very kind of interesting idea. And as you can imagine, the network and the requirements of this Ethereum network and the maintenance of this blockchain, making it secure, making it stable, this does require some kind of money to encourage people to build on it, to give them the tools they need to build on it. It requires, in other words, it needs some centralization. It needs some centralized guidance, but nobody wants to do this. And Vitalik, who is the face of Ethereum, as one of the kind of co-founders, really, really shies away from giving it this kind of direction because he doesn't want it, because being the face of Ethereum, being this kind of centralized, leading some kind of centralized authority authority into where Ethereum should go, what it should be, is kind of anathema to the entire decentralized ethos. And so to my mind, the whole platform is struggling. It's crying out for some leadership. Right?
You know, here's the thing that happens, and societies go through cycles, markets go through cycles. Just as we go from a massive bull market where shit doesn't make any sense, .com, venture capital, doesn't matter what sector you want to look at. We've been through these. It can go through massive bear markets where, again, things just don't make any sense. And in the same light, societies have gone, fully Marxist, for example, back towards, repealing that and saying we don't want that, and going to different structures, and essentially whatever your past is, if it's been successful, you think, oh, we'll do more of that. But sometimes there's a tipping point where more is not better. Yeah. And sometimes less is not better either. And so, we're talking about centralized structures. And if you think about central banks around the world, the fact that they're called central banks actually now is just makes even more sense than it ever did before, because they're much more centralized. They have they're more impactful in the global economy than they have been.
Much more involved in private decision making.
Well, I mean, if we just look at the ECB, they're buying up a whole lot of corporate debt, because nobody else wants it, and they're trying to prop up that market. And so the decentralized, more capitalistic approach, which we started with, I guess, post Bretton Woods, was you let the market figure it out. Let the individuals figure it out. Much in the same way with the Swiss, they go, let the cantons figure it out. If they want to build a park, fucking let them build a park. If they don't. And so there was that decentralized approach. And so, that's how we began things. And then it's become more and more centralized. And we've seen the cracks in that. And so the 2008 crisis was with that centralized. And look, we've had instances of it before. LTCM, after the Russian ruble collapsed, it showed that if you had this sort of centralized concentration of risk, it could cause a destabilization of the entire system. Hence the bailouts and so on and so forth. And then 2008 we had 2008 was LTCM on steroids, yeah. And so you had this consolidated, centralized risk taking place, which sort of has its benefits. Why? Because you can mobilize quickly and so on and so forth. But it means that you are at risk of exogenous events. Whereas a decentralized system allows, less risk. And so it's not, I think, a coincidence that Bitcoin, for example, was, as far as we can tell, was coded after the 2008 crisis, where they're like, okay, that's the devil. How do we come about with something completely opposite? But the idea that the opposite is the holy grail is, I think, where crypto or Bitcoin maximalists, they go too far as well. Life isn't like that. There is.
Well, I mean, the whole point about, we already said, the biological computation works, evolutionary computation works because it discards the stuff that doesn't work, right? And therefore selects the stuff that does work. So the whole thing is based on failure, right? And sometimes those failures are painful, so a world without failure doesn't exist, so a holy grail where nobody suffers, it cannot exist, right? It can't. Because you're now going against, frankly, you're going against the grain of, if you want to get right down to it, you're going against the grain of physics.
Yes.
Right. It's not, you're starting to try and break physical laws. There will be no failure. No, that's not consistent with the laws of physics. So I think.
And when we try and do that on a societal level, it is always turned into the worst that humanity has to offer. And when we do it now
if you want to try and, this is something that, I think my mum is a rabid, unreconstructed socialist, massive trade union, militant trade unionist. You know, for her, Jeremy Corbyn wasn't left wing enough, right? I mean, she doesn't talk to me. She doesn't talk about me to her friends because she's embarrassed, right? That her son is a hedge fund manager, right? What kind of, you know, what kind of socialist? Wales is a socialist, right? You know, which is kind of interesting, right? Because you know, on all sorts of kind of levels. But the thing that I feel that she doesn't understand, and other socialists, and even people who see themselves as quite kind of free market, they don't understand that when you want to try and impose equality, when you want to try and impose an outcome on, you know, a market outcome, because you don't like the free market outcome, you only try and impose one that you think is better. That requires a machinery, right? It requires some kind of machinery to impose that. In other words, it implies that you grant to an authority the power to coerce, right? You grant a higher authority the power to coerce and more equal outcome. And therefore, because the only way you can achieve this equal outcome is by granting power to someone to coerce, then you've just created a new type of inequality.
Yeah.
Right. And so the whole machine, and the more equality you want, the more coercion, the more coercive power is required, and therefore the greater the inequality
will be. It's interesting because one of the things that sorry, go on.
You never solve the equality problem. You cannot solve it, right? You just create a different type of inequality. And I think this is what the socialists don't understand. And that's why the Soviet Union went the way the Soviet Union went. And that's why North Korea is the way North Korea is. North Korea is not an equal society because all the power is concentrated in the hands of the party, right?
Well, if one of the things, and I've been talking a lot to our head trader Brad about this recently. If I go back and I think about what is it that made Western civilization the civilization, at least for our livelihoods, I would suggest that one of the predominant factors in that has been science. And so if we think about a scientific method, it is that you have a theory and you have the ability to know that it could be wrong. And so you have a theory and you put it out there. It could be a test tube and you're going to put a bit of mercury with a bit of, I don't know, something else. And you have the theory that something's going to happen, whatever that theory is. And then you say, okay, let's test it. And you either validate it or you invalidate it. And you go, oh, I thought that would happen. Shit, that didn't happen. Okay, theory's wrong. Scrap it. Let's keep going. And you keep, and then you bring the hive mind to that. Right? So you test it because you go, oh, Chris just tried this. He put a bit of mercury in with a bit of lead and nothing happened. And so I'm going to try something else. And you have thousands of people all working on this theory. And eventually you come up with, I don't know, penicillin, whatever it is, right? But that ability to acknowledge that we don't know and to have an environment where we can have freedom of thought and freedom of expression to find what does work and let that which works succeed and let that which doesn't work die. That is how you get exponential growth. And so as soon as we impede that, then we impede the entire process. If you think about capital formation, you cannot have capital formation without the ability to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I think one of the things that's kind of become clear, which is something that fascinates me, but something that I think has become clear in science over maybe the last 20 or 30 years, is that this kind of idea that information is actually the most kind of fundamental thing in the universe. It's not matter. It's not matter and energy. It's information. It's even more kind of fundamental than than that. And ultimately, everything is about information processing. So life is very much about information processing. We are organic information processors. Our behavior is encoded in our DNA, and we are the product of a kind of genetic algorithm. And that genetic algorithm selects the stuff that works, and works in inverted commas, right? Now you can use genetic algorithms, and computer scientists use genetic. I think there's bloody one in the Microsoft Excel solver, right? You can use this genetic algorithm to optimize, right? So it is an optimization algorithm, the genetic algorithm. And there's this kind of idea that actually, the universe is just doing the same thing. The universe is actually an information processor. So everything is an information processor, right? Including an economy, or a business, or an enterprise, right? We're doing it right now. We're exchanging information. We're exchanging ideas right now. If you try to eliminate, the basis of that information processing and of that evolutionary algorithm is failure, right? If you try to weed out failure, you're starving the computer of the information that it needs, right? And so you will not optimize, in inverted commas, and anything like as efficiently as you would if you permitted failure. You will not get as good an outcome. And so the problem, I think, with kind of central planning is exactly that. You don't have the information. You're starving the system of the information that it needs to compute.
And that information is often failure.
Absolutely, that's information for sure. That's absolutely kind of information.
Which is one of the things that distresses me so much about the education system as it is today. That, we don't celebrate failure in the schools or in the universities. It should be celebrated, because you can't have success without failure, and multiple failure, right? You think about a guy like Tiger Woods, who is probably the most successful golfer of all time. Like one of the reasons that he's such a successful golfer, presumably over and above his genetic abilities and so on and so forth, is that he's failed so many times. Just over and over and over and over. So there's one individual, one within a species that's succeeded extraordinarily well. And so and this is even a socialist issue, is like when they see that, they go, well, we want that. But we don't want the failure. And we've seen this, for example, in the universities. One of the things which I've been writing about for the last 2-3 years is this incredible danger that comes with rights. You're affecting my rights. And I was like, well, hang on a second. You don't have any rights without responsibility. You can't have the two. They're not mutually exclusive. So how can you have your rights or somebody else's responsibility? You go, oh, I want human rights. Well, but what does that mean? Oh, it means that you have safety in your house. Well, how does that come about? Oh, well, that's a police force, for example. Well, that's a responsibility. It's a person who's got to get up every day, and he's got to, train and so on and so forth. And so, there's a pervasive, and I guess that's Marxism. If you look at Marxist ideology, it's one where responsibilities don't exist to the extent that they should, but there's all these rights, and it's myopic and it's dangerous. And if we think about the markets today, isn't that really what we're doing with the central banks? Nobody can fail. We don't want failure.
Basically, I agree with that. The kind of irony is pain is a very important thing, right? Pain is the transmission of information, and of important information. Pain is what tells you not to put your hand in a fire, right? So it's a very, very kind of protective thing, but obviously we don't like it. We try to avoid it, right? That's how it works. So the kind of irony is that you take that to the extreme, and you can do yourself damage. If you allow yourself to be subject to kind of micro stresses, so if you run a cold shower and stand in a cold shower for a couple of minutes every day. It's not much fun. It's not particularly pleasant. But it's good for you. If you sit in a, we're kind of lucky enough to live by a lake. In the winter, I kind of go in the lake every day, and it's kind of 4 or 5 degrees. Now, if I was to stay in that lake for an hour, I would probably die of hypothermia. I would drown. If I sit in there for 5 minutes, it doesn't kill me. And what happens is physiologically, there are a number of benefits. Yep. So this all sorts of kind of benefits in terms of your immune system, white blood cells, because your body actually starts to harness its. It gains from the information that you're giving it. It feeds off the information that you're giving it, and it actually starts to build up resistance. And that resistance is incredibly beneficial to your health, to your longevity. It's the same with fasting, right? If you don't eat, if you just allow yourself to go hungry for a period of time, saunas, if you actually sit in an incredible heat for 10 minutes, all of these kind of micro stresses, they might be unpleasant, but they're phenomenally good for you. Yes. And I feel this is hormesis, and this is, I think, the role of recessions. This is the role of allowing people to really have the, to effectively feel the pain of their mistakes, right? Because it's feeling the pain of your mistakes, knowing that your mistakes will actually involve some pain that makes you better, hopefully, at not making those mistakes in the future, right? And therefore, it strengthens everyone. It's actually good. So allowing, again, go back to the same point, allowing people to fail is important. The Federal Reserve, central banks, policymakers' instinct is to prevent that pain. And I think in the near term, that's obviously that's a good thing, right? But in the medium to long term, it's difficult to see how it can possibly be a good thing.
You're weakening the overall immune system by doing it.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is you're creating a system which is there's two things. One is the feedback mechanism, in that the participants in that system look to the recent past to identify what the future looks like. So we look to 2008, we go, they solved the problem. We look to the LTCM crisis, we go, they solved the problem. Oh wait, solved the problem. Now we're in 2020, and they say they're going to solve the problem. And so everybody believes it. And at some point, and then maybe it's possible, maybe it's right, but at some point what you have is such a weakened immune system, and the virus, if you will, that comes along overwhelms it, and it's impossible for it to actually deal with it. Whereas if it had gone through, so if you think about it, like as kids, we grow up crawling around on the floor. I think we're probably designed to crawl. Why? Because you put shit in your mouth, you lick the floor. Like that's what babies do. What they're doing is they're building their immune system, right?
Well, they're also learning. They're learning.
And so you try and take all of that away, and you're immediately, I mean, that's why little kids always got snotty noses, and that, like, they're picking up every virus, every bug, but what they're doing is their body's just building antibodies to it. Boom, 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 boom. And that's why, we don't get sick from when our kids are, getting sick. We don't get it. Why? We've got the antibodies. We've built it. But now, if you took a child and you didn't allow any of that, you gave them this pristine environment where they can't get anything, and then you get them to like 20 years of age, and you just send them off into the world, and they go off to Delhi. Like, holy shit. They don't have any ability to cope with this absolute deluge of viruses and things that are going to attack its system. And so essentially that's how I'm thinking about what we've got in terms of the market structure and environment that we've got today. We've tried to create this pristine environment, and every time a virus has come along, we've said, no, we're going to take care of it. We'll walk it off, we'll shield it off. We got your back. And then the market participants act accordingly, where they go, okay, cool. We believe that's true. And it creates an absolutely asymmetric setup where, if I look at the markets, I don't know what it is that you're particularly interested in. I'm curious to know that. We can dig into it in a bit. But there is so, coming back to what we talked about before, managing family and friends' money, I sit there and I'm like, I don't want to lose anyone's money. And then I work through the various asset classes of like, what is it that you'd buy? And like I had a friend just the other day, and he's like, I think I'm just going to put some money in money market, some money market fund, because I want it safe. And I was like, well, if you put it in T-bills or cash, he's like, nah, I can get another 1%. And I'm like, okay, you can get 1% more by putting it in money market fund. And money market funds nowadays, based on the fact that central banks have pushed yields to fairly absurd levels, meaning that the returns are really paltry. We've got the structure now where a lot of these money market funds is just basically going into the repo market, and you're funding the Deutsche Banks of the world, right? and you've got this sort of absurd environment even where the least risky assets within the commercial paper market, one could argue that they just need to be of size and they need to have access to credit. And so if they've got access to credit and they've got size, two things are going to happen. They're probably going to get bailed out, and or the credit available to them will continue to flow because they're too risky to fall over. And so you could look at some institutions which are smaller, probably more better capitalized, but they don't have any political leanings or connections. They're not going to receive any bailouts, and then you look at the larger institutions which almost certainly will, and there's a decent argument to say, well, those would be the ones that you should actually be lending money to. But essentially, so the market lands up pushing capital towards those which are not in a world sans those interventions or sans that structure. They would be forced to fail. And so what we're talking about with that structure of allowing things to fail so that the genetics can come through has been interfered with in the capital markets. And so I'm sitting there like, what is it that you actually, where do you hide in a world where bonds, or if you're going on the sovereign side of things, you're either at, if you're going into bonds, you're losing money. Well, like on a yield basis. And the only reason you're going to get money back is if somebody pays more for the bond. You go down the commercial paper or corporate debt markets. There's some stuff there, but again, all of that is actually impacted by the whole structure of the bond market, in such that that hunt for yield has meant that anything that actually looked reasonable, while it might have healthy balance sheets and everything else, is now not yielding you very much at all. Yet you are still taking risk. And I kind of work down these various sectors, and it's an extraordinary time in terms of, like, I think there's less to invest in. I feel like there's far less to invest in than there has been in my career. How are you looking at the market? What are you interested in?
So that's another big question. I think the simple answer is we're finding plenty of things to invest in. I think there are plenty of things to invest in. I think as a statement before, kind of before kind of giving a detailed answer, I think it's kind of interesting. An interesting observation is this. And this relates to what you were saying earlier about the cheapness of financing, the negative yields on government bonds and government paper, and how that's distorting everything else. I think, by the way, I think there's some kind of interesting numbers you can crunch that questions the extent to which risk is mispriced, believe it or not. Okay, which we don't have to kind of go into right now. But all I would say is I'm not sure that the markets are as distorted as is commonly made out. Okay, that's So that's one thing to say. I'm not saying that they're not. But I'm not saying that they are either. Right? I think that it's just when you look carefully at various risk premia, risk premia defined as the excess spread or coupon or expected return versus government bonds.
Yes.
Right? When you look at these risk premia, what you find is
on a relative basis, I agree, 100%.
But suppose you say, but I don't kind of have the kind of the actual kind of numbers up in front of me right now. But if you look at the spread of, say, high yield over treasuries right now, it's well within its historical range, right? Now, if you look at the performance of high yield since the Fed made its announcement, you can see that it's gone through the roof. And you look at the year-to-date performance of high yield, you might say this should be much lower. We're down, 10%.
But we're within those parameters. Yeah.
But we're within the parameters. And now, suppose, let's just say this kind of hypothesis: central banks are distorting risk pricing in markets. Suppose that's true. We would expect to see very, very compressed risk spreads. Right, and I don't think we do. The risk spreads are roughly in line with the historical. Now, you might say that they're too tight. Okay, fine, they're too tight, but they're within their historical range. They have been significantly tighter, right? And you might say, yeah, but we're about to face this huge wipeout and this huge. Okay, fine, right? But how bad is that going to be? We're not quite sure. We don't know, frankly. We don't know what the kind of fallout is going to be. So what I'm saying is it's just not necessarily obvious, right? So I think that this is kind of something that's important to make. Now, in terms of the overall, what keeps the absolute yield low, so now we're talking about the absolute yield, the absolute return, the absolute expected return, rather than the excess return. These are incredibly low because government bond yields are low, right?
Yep.
Fine. So we might say that actually capital market yields are very, very low, right? And we might also say that they seem far too low, right? Given where nominal GDP, and this is the distortion that the central banks have created. And again, I think that there's probably some truth to that part of the argument. I think that the second part, though, which is interesting, is this: suppose you don't have access to capital markets. What kind of return? What kind of interest do you have to pay if you want to borrow, right? Because you're not going to borrow 1 or 2%.
Yeah. We don't get to do that.
If you don't have access, right? And so I know some kind of some managers, some very interesting kind of credit managers that we talk to and that we invest in, and their niche is actually effectively they're just doing what the banks used to do. They're lending to individuals, to small businesses with good collateral, with good credit worthiness. And they're lending at double-digit rates.
Yep,
right?
That's what I'm saying.
So there's a huge bifurcation, right? Do you have access to capital markets? Yeah. Oh, in that case, you can borrow for like a couple of percent. Have you got a really crappy credit rating? Oh, you can borrow for 9%. Whereas if you're small, too small to have access to credit markets. But you've got, I'll give you one example, no names mentioned, but one example. I was speaking to this the fund that I know, and one of their clients is a serial entrepreneur. He's made an awful lot of. He's done very, very well for himself. He's made a lot of money for himself, and mainly in aircraft parts. The aircraft parts business is a kind of interesting. If you know the different aircraft parts, right, you can source these aircraft, right? Planes last for like 30, 40 years, right? The problem is not necessarily the engine. The problem is sometimes finding the spare parts for the engine, finding the spare parts for the plane. Sometimes these spare parts can go for incredible amounts of value if you know how to price them, right? And this is where this guy has made his money. So this friend of mine, this manager friend of mine, hedge fund manager friend of mine, says this guy's got assets, personal assets worth about 40 million, right? And this includes a house in prime part, luxury part of Los Angeles, right? Worth about 10 million, right? Completely unencumbered, totally unencumbered, right? It needs a 5 million loan, right? So they give him a 5 million loan, 12 months, something like 12%, fully collateralized by the guy's house, right? Now, that's a great bit of business. Why are the banks not doing it? Well, because they can't, because of Basel requirements, because they have to set aside too much capital. Frankly, they can't be bothered to write such a small ticket, 5 million. It's just not worth it. They're not going to be right. So this guy basically falls through the cracks. He doesn't have access to capital markets, but he's paying basically, kind of double digit. And presumably this guy's an entrepreneur. He knows what he's doing. He knows what the value of his project is. Whatever the double-digit interest rate is totally fine for him. He can pay that and still make a very, very tidy return on his entrepreneurial project, right? Yeah. So that 12% or whatever it is, that 12% interest rate is absolutely fine. That's not what you're getting in the capital markets. So there's this huge distortion, I think massive distortion, which is visible when you look at the interest rates that people are actually paying in the kind of direct lending markets, right? It just doesn't bear any resemblance to what you can get in the capital markets. So I think so that's the first thing, right? That's very clear evidence of the distortion, in my opinion, right? And the unintended consequence, right? You're protecting big borrowers, right? At the expense of little borrowers, right? Because it might be...
It's a crowding out of the markets.
This entrepreneur can easily pay his 12%, but at the margin, there might be entrepreneurs with slightly less robust businesses or slightly less, but still attractive, right? Yeah. But those guys get squeezed out. So these are the entrepreneurs which are being squeezed out of the market because you're funding Deutsche Bank at these prices, right? Yeah. So that's absolutely kind of happening. Now, in terms of your question, where do you invest? Well, that's actually already a good starting point, right? If you look hard enough, you can actually supply capital on sensible terms to get a sensible return. There's also other parts, I think, of the capital markets which are off the beaten track, which are actually quite interesting and where you can still get a decent return, which are less distorted. And I think that our kind of hedge fund is going to be a fund of funds. Our kind of thing really is just investing in very, very niche strategies. We're very, very kind of off-the-run strategies and off-the-run managers. And this obviously has the kind of benefit of being very, very uncorrelated to the broader equity markets. But you can also get very, very you can build a very, very diverse portfolio of these kind of niche strategies. And so we're seeing, I think, quite kind of interesting opportunities in these types of places. So some kind of direct lending, I don't think, it's not been a problem for us finding interesting investment opportunities.
Right. And tell me, so what you were just discussing is essentially in the private markets, right? Is much of what you're doing in publicly listed stuff, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, actually, our focus is at the moment is very much on the liquid part of the market, right? Because I know that stuff. That's what I've done my entire career. When I built that kind of liquids part of the business for the family office, it was all liquid. It was all highly liquid. Yeah. So our fund will be 12-month liquidity. We won't be able to invest in any funds which can't offer 12-month liquidity. When I say they can't offer 12-month liquidity, they can't legitimately offer 12. I know there's plenty of funds out there who will offer you weekly or monthly liquidity, and they shouldn't be doing that.
But the bid-ask is not
like 2 or 3 years. Closed-end structure. It's just, Neil Woodford, I think, actually in the UK. I don't know if you kind of followed this in your part of the world. Neil Woodford was a kind of star.
Yeah,
star fund. You know all about him, right? Yeah. And he had literally a daily liquidity in his vehicle. I think it was daily liquidity, and he had like 20% or 10%, 15%, far too much because it was non-zero. Invested in stuff that was illiquid, right? There was no market for it. And what happened was when people started to redeem, there was a run on the fund, and the guys who trusted him. The guys who backed him, the guys who that's Neil Woodford, he knows what he's doing. This is a good guy. They are the guys who got gated in the end. They are the guys who left carrying all this illiquid shit that had no mark. And the reason for that is because Woodford missold liquidity. So when I talk about the liquidity that we want from our managers, it can't be missold. It has to be legitimate, genuine liquidity. Of course, on the assumption that we can do that, and we can. we can't invest in closed-end vehicles, not at the moment. It's something that we'd like to do, hopefully in a couple of years' time. We think we know how to, but it's not what we're doing right now. So this is very much liquid markets, not necessarily securities, right? When you've got short-term lending that rolls off, direct loans, there's no market price for those loans, but they repay in 60 days or 90 days. So there's a kind of natural kind of roll off to the book, yeah. Right? So it's absolutely legitimate to have, say, 90-day liquidity for a private lending fund. Yeah. You can get the same thing with litigation finance. For example, we like insurance. We like the insurance markets. We like life, various parts of the life insurance markets, various parts of the catastrophe insurance markets. And then there's some kind of, then there's more traditional hedge funds. Believe it or not, there are still hedge funds out there who are hedging. There are still hedge funds who are genuinely uncorrelated from broader markets. They're not just kind of overpricing their beta. So we're invested in some of those guys. Some of those guys, for example, in convertible arbitrage, there's some very, it's making a comeback. It's a very interesting space. Systematic trading, for all of the kind of overcrowdedness of the big trend followers, the Wintons, the aspects. There's an awful lot of stuff at the 200, 300, 400 million dollar AUM. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of very, very talented algo traders with very, very decent track records. And they know exactly how to, and they're not too big for their alpha opportunity. So we as I say, we're kind of finding, we can put together I think a very, very sound, robust portfolio even in this environment. And I think importantly with a fund of funds, you've got that whole range of strategies. We believe we can put together a strategy that is actually independent, fundamentally independent. I don't just mean statistically uncorrelated, it's fundamentally independent from some of the kind of craziness that you're seeing in central banks.
And so how do you go about position sizing within that? Is that something that is a client allocation where they choose that, or is it something that's driven by you guys?
I mean, I should say the fund that we'll have this up and running. It's in process right now. It will probably be open for subscriptions in about 1 to 2 months, but it will be properly open for business and launched in October. My partners and I are bootstrapping it with our own capital. So this is very much our own vehicle. Which we are kind of opening up to kind of friends and family because we might as well. Why not? Yeah. Right? We're doing the work already. So that's kind of the objective here, the plan. But we are very much the portfolio managers. This is a fund. Invest in the fund if you want to. Don't invest in it if you don't. This isn't a kind of. It's not a kind of private club network. It's not an investment club. Which we kind of have up and running anyway through Popular Delusions. We do write in research or subscription research. We do write about investments that we find interesting. Some of those investments will not make their way into the fund because they're not necessarily appropriate for what we're trying to do with the fund, but they're nevertheless interesting. And we have connected interesting investors to interesting managers and interesting investment opportunities using that research. So, there is a kind of investment club aspect to what we do at Calderwood, but that's not the fund that we're launching. The fund that we're launching is a fund of funds. We are the managers. In terms of position sizing, we don't really go by, I think we do things maybe slightly in an inverse way to the way many people might think about position sizing. I think a lot of people, certainly in equity land, your position size is determined according to your expected return, right? So you would allocate more to your higher expected return opportunities. We kind of go the opposite direction. We actually allocate more to the opportunities which have the less risk. And so, for reasons which I can kind of go into if you're interested. But the idea we have is really the least risky opportunities have the bigger allocations, right? If the lower the risk of a big drawdown, the lower the risk of a blow up, the bigger the allocation. And that allows us to actually take quite extreme risk for certain opportunities, but always in the right size. It will always be a small size. And that's how we build a portfolio. You might look at the line items and think, holy crap, what the hell are these guys doing? So when you look at the overall portfolio, you have a very, very kind of smooth return stream.
That makes perfect sense to me. And it's one of the things that I keep hammering home, both in the publication and just within our own portfolio. But it's just the, the idea that you can actually have something in your portfolio, which if you position size it correctly, you can, it can provide you with those extraordinary asymmetric returns. But if it's a 1% of AUM, it's not a, people will look at it and go like, well, hang on a second, what are you owning that for? But if you think about that tail risk side of things, it is that traditional hedge where if you've got it, and it's like, you bought a house and do you buy insurance? Of course you buy insurance. Nobody stops and thinks that they're not going to buy insurance. And it's similar things, but there you have asymmetry, because you might spend, I don't know, say for shits and giggles, $1,000 a year on fire insurance, and you've got $1 million house, and it's like, well, if it does blow up, burn down, that's an asymmetric payoff. And so
you're strengthening your portfolio. You're strengthening your portfolio by
having risk,
by having insurance.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And the right size, right?
Yeah, because if you go too far down that path, naturally, then you're not paying $1,000 a year. If you're paying $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year on $1 million property,
that's right. I mean, if you've got a $100,000 house and it's you're paying out or $200,000 house and you're paying kind of $1,000 a year in insurance, why is $1,000 a year the right size? Why is that the right size? Answer: because that, in the event that something happens to my £200,000 property, that $1,000 a year contract pays out $200,000. So I position size in such a way that in that scenario, this is what it will be worth. Yeah. And so when effectively, it's a kind of option. You can position size options in exactly the same way. If you position size a 10x opportunity, you're not going to put probably 30% of your portfolio in a 10x opportunity, because most 10x opportunities are also, they can go to zero, right? So you might position size and say, well, suppose this does 10x, it would then be 50% of my portfolio. So, which is probably going to be too big. So maybe I'll just put 5% in this 10x opportunity, and if I don't want it to be 50, I'll put 2.5% of my portfolio in this 10x opportunity, because I'm now position sizing according to what I think the position can ultimately turn into, rather than what it is right now.
And of course that also comes into, what does the rest of your portfolio look like? What is it that you're hedging? Because if you don't have a house, then so.
And you don't need house insurance, absolutely. Yeah. And so, and I think this is where the portfolio construction gets interesting, and I think that a lot of people really, really miss with just purely kind of numeric kind of portfolio optimization algorithms. You really have to know the portfolio. You have to know what's in the portfolio to know how it reacts under stress. And so the first stage to knowing how to hedge a portfolio is to know what's in the portfolio in the first place. And I think when you speak to like really, really good ARB managers, really, really good portfolio constructors, they know exactly not just the kind of equity risk, credit risk, duration risk, all of these kind of things, which you can kind of basically just kind of read off the tin. And what's the kind of liquidity risk, right? What happens if there's a liquidity event? What is what's the convexity, right? What's the actual convexity downside into the upside in the event that something? So it might well look as though I've got a portfolio that's net long risk, except my net shorts are highly convex. In which case, in the event of a down market, in the event of a liquidity crunch, my convexity kicks in a way that offsets my longs. Now I have a well-hedged portfolio, even though if you just read off the tin, you might say, oh, but you're net long 60%. Well, that's because you're not understanding the portfolio properly, right?
Yeah. Which is, of course, how the original futures and options markets began back in Amsterdam. And it was all farming, and it was that when I try to explain that structure of a market to people, that's the easiest way to think about it. It's like, as a farmer, right? You got a crop coming through. What if your crop doesn't deliver? What if you have a flooding, or you have a drought or something like that? What does that look like? And then how much of your production do you forward sell, right? And so on and so forth. And that's really, I think, the right way to think about any portfolio construction. It's great to get your thoughts on all that, Dylan. We've been bumping up now against an hour and a half, so I think I better let you get on with your day, and we'll certainly have to do this again sometime.
No, definitely. It's been kind of interesting. Kind of interesting conversation. We covered quite a lot. Yeah, really interesting. One of the things we didn't really get to talk about was one of the examples we didn't go through on the decentralization versus decentralization, which I'll kind of leave you with. The idea of kind of decentralization versus centralization and the benefits of decentralization. I think that one of the arguments in favor of centralization is actually American history, right? Where, you kind of, the way America grew up, and we've still seen the kind of the repercussions of it today. You had its Confederate states, southern states, which are based on slave labor. Right now, a decentralized approach would have been just to let the states make their own decisions, right? But it was only when you centralized it, and it was actually kind of the centralized power of the South the South was weaker than the centralized power of the North, that you actually moved to kind of you take the first steps to eliminating slavery. Had you had the kind of laissez-faire of the decentralized ideal, and which we both have a lot of sympathy for, but if you had that ideal in operation, would you still have slave states in the South today, right? And I think, it's kind of an interesting counter to the decentralization.
I'd never thought about that. That's a brilliant insight, because what you're dealing with there is just pure competitiveness, and it'll be difficult to argue that a state that abolished it in the short term would be competitive with one that didn't. In the longer term, you can certainly make the case, because what you potentially do is you bring into that workforce an ability for that workforce to actually grow and expand, and to bring forth more ideas and so on and so forth. So over time, one could certainly make the argument that abolishing it was the better cause. But in the short term, there's sort of, it'd be difficult to make the case that your farmers that were your cotton fields that if you had one chap one side of the border, another chap on the other side, that the one who didn't have slave labor would be competitive with the one that did. It doesn't seem like a. So yeah, it's a very good point.
It was imposed on them. The abandonment. They didn't abandon slavery. The South did not abandon slavery. Right? It was imposed on them.
Yes.
Right. And actually, I think as anyone who understands American history knows, they clung on to it for a long time. The loss of the Civil War was kind of a milestone in the elimination of slavery, the abandonment of slavery, but it didn't actually. It probably arguably took another 100 years. Some would say that the kind of age of mass incarceration, it's just morphed into a different kind of shape. But the point is, the South did not abandon slavery. The elimination of slavery was imposed on the South. So, to those with a fetish for decentralization, do you believe in pure decentralization or not? Because if you do believe in decentralization, you would never have imposed equal rights on the South. The American North would never have abolished slavery, right? Because they believed in decentralization. So, by the way, I think it was right to abolish slavery. It was completely right, but I think it's just a very interesting kind of question to ask. These, those who have a fetish for decentralization.
And on that point, if you think about the formation of many of the things that have formed the basis of Western civilization, things such as human rights and a set of human rights rules or statutes, if you will, that have been widely implemented across Western countries. Now, that's centralization, right? It wasn't like there was a concentrated effort in a centralized form to say, hey, this is what we believe, and this is what we're going to impose, and we're going to actually stand up for it. And that was definitely not a decentralized process, which just sort of organically happened. So interesting concepts to think about.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Listen, I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks a million. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really kind of flattered
thank you so much for your time.
Cool.